They always called me a dropout, a failure who couldn't follow orders. At every holiday dinner, they raised their glasses to my sister's promotions and looked through me like I was already gone. So when I sat quietly in the visitor bleachers at Fort Garnett, no one expected anything least of all her. The drills stopped mid-stride. Sergeant Frey cut through the cadets like a blade and saluted me in front of everyone, Commander Hale, ma'am. Gasps rippled, rifles slipped, and Cambria's face drained white. I only said 6 words, calm, steady, deliberate. I'm off duty. Keep this quiet. But by nightfall, the whispers weren't about her anymore. They were about me, the sister they buried too soon. It didn't start with a salute. It started with silence, the kind that hums under your skin at family dinners when your name never makes it into a toast. Every Christmas, Dad lifted his glass and praised Cambria. To the daughter who makes us proud, he'd beam. The room would clap, the silverware would rattle, and I'd feel the weight of my fork grow heavier in my hand. My name was never mentioned. At best, Mom would smile at me politely, as though I were a guest instead of her blood. I wasn't invisible. I was something worse, a shadow cast by their golden child. But it wasn't always that way. I used to think if I worked hard enough, I could earn my place at their table. At 16, while other kids were sneaking beers behind the gym, I was running laps in combat boots that left blisters the size of quarters. At 19, when most of my friends were figuring out majors, I was memorizing rifle serial numbers and folding uniforms until my fingers cracked. I believed if I endured the pain long enough one day, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at her. What they never saw was how much I gave away just to stay standing. I remember the barracks, how the air always smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, a mechanical heartbeat that never slowed. I remember holding my breath during inspection, praying my bed corners were sharp enough, my boots polished enough, my posture unshakable. Every detail mattered, and still none of it was ever enough. The panic crept in slowly. At first it was harmless, a jitter in my hand, before a night march, a flutter in my chest when the whistle blew. Then it escalated. My palms locked so tightly, my nails dug crescents into my skin. My throat closed mid-exercise. I'd stare at my squad mates, their faces blurred, their voices warped, while mine stayed frozen in a body that wouldn't obey. It was during a night drill that everything finally snapped. The instructor barked, "Move," but my legs refused. The radio cracked. I tasted blood where I'd bitten my lip. The laughter that followed was worse than the failure itself. Civilian material, my commanding officer muttered loud enough for the whole squad to hear. The words stuck like shards in my lungs. By dawn, I had made my choice. I didn't storm out. I didn't argue. I packed in silence. One uniform folded with surgical precision, one pair of boots left by the door like offerings at a shrine. No note, no slam, just absence. My parents told the story differently. To them, I cracked under pressure. I was the Hale daughter who couldn't handle discipline. It was easier for them to say I'd failed than to admit I'd walked away on my own terms. Failure gave them closure. My silence gave them control of the narrative. What they didn't know was that I hadn't just walked away. I'd walked into something else. The office was small, windowless, painted in a shade of gray that felt intentional. They asked no questions about why I left. They only asked if I was willing to disappear. I signed the papers with a hand that still shook from panic, and in exchange, the world erased me. My name was scrubbed from records, my files sealed. To the public, I ceased to exist. They called it Echo, a program that thrived in shadows where silence was not weakness, but weapon. No parades, no medals, no one to clap at family dinners. Just missions that mattered to people who'd never know my name. The work was brutal in its simplicity. A foreign dialect memorized overnight. A new face built from a haircut, an accent, a borrowed jacket. A listening device planted in a conversation no one would ever admit happened. My body carried the scars, faint burns, a thin line across my shoulder blade, but I never let them show. By 36, I wasn't a dropout. I was a strategist. I saw patterns before others saw chaos. I mapped the field before anyone moved. I wasn't weak. I was necessary. But at home, in that old house with the crooked mailbox, I was still the girl who couldn't cut it. And every time they raised their glasses to Cambria, I sat in silence, letting them believe I had crumbled. Because sometimes, surviving requires letting the world mislabel you until the day the truth steps back into the light. The invitation didn't even bother pretending. It wasn't, "We'd love to see you," it wasn't, "We miss you." It was a directive typed in stiff black ink on embossed cardstock. Celebration for Lieutenant Cambria Hale. Sunday at 6. Wear something appropriate. Not an invitation, an order. Like I was 19 again, still under their roof, still the daughter who never measured up. 7 years had passed since I'd last stepped onto their cracked driveway, but when I pulled in that night, nothing had changed. The mailbox still leaned left as though exhausted by carrying their name. The porch light still flickered like it couldn't make up its mind. Even the scent in the air, cut grass mixed with faint engine oil, pulled me back to a time when I used to sit on those steps and dream of being enough. Inside the house was dressed not for family, but for ceremony. Banners stretched across the dining room wall. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Cambria Hale." A slideshow flickered on the television, cycling through photographs of my sister in crisp uniforms, mid-salute shaking hands with officers whose names I'd once memorized. Her smile was radiant polished. In every frame she looked like the daughter they wanted. Not one photo of me, not a single trace that I had ever worn. The same uniform bled, the same blisters carried the same weight. To them my existence had been edited out as though failure itself could be erased by omission. Dad spotted me first. He didn't hug me. He didn't even stand. He just asked, "So, what are you doing these days?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were already drifting back to the slideshow, as if my answer wouldn't matter anyway. Before I could respond, he launched into Cambria's achievements, her latest field scores, her placement in the top 10%. Mom nodded proudly, clutching her glass like it was proof of her own success. Aunt Kendra smirked from the buffet table, and without missing a beat said, "Didn't you used to play waitress at Applebee's? Looks like it stuck." Laughter fluttered through the room, polite and cruel at the same time. I smiled back, steady, unshaken. "I'm better at serving now," I said, coolly letting the words hang in the air like a blade. Some caught the edge, most didn't. Then came the moment that always arrived like clockwork. "Morgan, can you grab some extra forks from the kitchen?" someone asked. "And then water, too, please. The table's empty." No one else moved. No one asked if I minded. It was assumed. It always was. So I went. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and baked ham, thick in the air like approval I'd never receive. I filled the glasses, gathered the forks, and listened to Cambria's laughter ripple down the hallway. Her voice was lit by admiration, while mine was drowned out by the sound of water hitting glass. When I returned, every seat at the table was taken. The name cards had been neatly arranged, deliberate in their exclusion. Mom blinked at me, feigning surprise at my existence. "There's a folding chair on the porch by the grill," she said, as if it were perfectly reasonable. So I sat outside. The metal chair was cold against my legs. The propane tank hissed softly nearby, carrying the sharp scent of gas. Through the window, I could see them raising glasses again, toasting Cambria, while my reflection hovered faintly in the glass present, but never included. For a moment, I let the bitterness rise. 7 years gone, and nothing had changed. I was still the shadow at the edge of the celebration, still the daughter excused from the story. Then my coat vibrated. Not with a phone, no one in that room would have called me anyway, but with the secure pulse of a device stitched into the lining. A single buzz, sharp and coded. I slipped my hand inside, pressing the concealed screen. The message was short, clinical observer assignment issued. Echo protocol, Fort Garnett, initiate passive assessment. I read it twice, the words sparking something deep inside me. The timing wasn't coincidence. While my family toasted Cambria, I had just been assigned to the very base she called home. A slow smile touched my lips. They thought I was nothing more than a dropout who once carried trays of food. They thought seating me on a porch meant exile. But the truth was, sitting in the palm of my hand, a mission that tethered me to the world they swore I couldn't survive. I wasn't back home for their forgiveness. I wasn't here to prove myself at their table. I had returned because the same country that erased me still needed me. And this time, the war I was fighting wasn't just across oceans or behind sealed doors. It was inside my own family's myth, ready to fracture under the weight of truth. Fort Garnett didn't look like much from the outside, just another sprawl of chain-link fences, dust-swept yards and brick buildings, sun-bleached into sameness. To most people, it was a base like any other, a place for cadets to sweat and salute. But to me, it was a map with invisible coordinates, a place I already knew how to enter without leaving footprints. I arrived in silence. Tactical slacks, plain black windbreaker visitor's badge clipped to my chest. Neutral. Invisible. I didn't need rank stitched on my sleeve. I carried clearance in the serial code tucked discreetly into my pocket. No one gave me a second glance as I moved through the south gate, and that was exactly how I liked it. Cambria's unit was on the lower range boots, striking the dirt in unison. Her chin lifted, eyes sharp, every line of her posture screaming confidence. I watched her for a moment, remembering how I used to drill the same way, measuring myself against expectations I could never meet. She didn't notice me. Or maybe she did and chose not to. Either way, it didn't matter. My presence wasn't for her. Sergeant Mason Frey noticed. He always noticed. His reputation was carved from the bones of broken cadets. He was infamous for spotting weakness before recruits even realized they had it. That morning, his gaze cut through the formation and landed squarely on me. He didn't hesitate. Mid-stride, he pivoted boots, slamming the dirt, and marched directly to the bleachers. The world seemed to hold its breath. 50 cadets froze eyes, darting between their feared instructor and the anonymous figure in the crowd. And then, in front of all of them, Frey saluted. "Commander Hale, ma'am, I wasn't informed you'd be observing today." Gasps rippled. Cambria's rifle slipped from her hands, clattering to the ground. I didn't flinch. My voice was steady, deliberate. "At ease, Sergeant. I'm off duty. Keep this quiet." But whispers were already blooming like wildfire. By the time I left 15 minutes later, rumors had taken root. And that was exactly the point. The truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to be seeded. Back in my quarters, I retrieved the steel drive I'd planted months earlier. Sleek brushed metal, no markings, no branding, just a faint grid etched into one side. I'd slipped it into Cambria's gym bag the last time I saw her disguised as a gift. She never questioned it. Why would she? To her, I was still the dropout sister bringing snacks, maybe a sweatshirt. She never looked deeper, until now. The drive wasn't a keepsake. It was a tripwire one designed to activate only if someone tried to dig where they shouldn't. And Cambria, in her restless curiosity, had finally touched it. The system pinged instantly, alerting me across encrypted channels. Unauthorized access, internal breach, not by a foreign actor, but by my own blood. I sat back in the stiff chair, staring at the metadata, scrolling across my screen. At first glance, it was nothing more than a blip cadet-level clearance nibbling at a classified file. But the signature beneath it told a different story. Curtis Vaughn. The name sent a cold weight through me. Vaughn had been a civilian contractor years back. Genius coder, dangerous opportunist. I'd flagged his unauthorized injections into the Echo interface, and just like that, he vanished, terminated quietly off the books. Or so we thought. But the code was still alive, buried in dormant nodes waiting for the wrong hands to trigger it. Cambria's hands. I should have been angry, furious even. Instead, I felt something heavier inevitability. Vaughn hadn't planted this landmine for random cadets. He'd planted it for me. He wanted the breach to ping my retired clearance, to frame me as compromised, to drag me into the light I'd spent my life avoiding. And my sister had handed him the perfect door. Still, I didn't call her. I didn't march into her barracks and demand an explanation. That wasn't how Echo worked. Silent counterattack required patience. You don't confront a storm head-on, you watch it, measure it, and move only when the map reveals the path. So I dug. Line by line, I decrypted the data, stripping away Vaughn's sloppy camouflage. His signature was everywhere like fingerprints smeared across glass. He wanted me to see it. He wanted the tribunal, the humiliation, the fall. Fine. Let him think he'd written the story. I'd let the system believe I was compromised. Let the whispers spread, let the tribunal convene. And then when every eye was on me, I'd turn the trap back on him. That's the art of silence. You don't strike when they expect. You let them underestimate, dismiss, laugh, and then you let the truth drop like steel on concrete. I closed the file, slipped the drive into a lead-lined pouch, and slid it back into my coat. Cambria had no idea what she'd stepped on. To her, it was just a strange gift with a humming secret. To me, it was a reminder. The war I'd built without a uniform wasn't over. It was only getting louder. By sunrise the next day, Fort Garnett was already humming with tension. It wasn't the drills or the marching, it was the whispers. Commander Hale, isn't she the dropout? No, she's echo clearance, I heard. Then why was her file locked? Everywhere I walked, conversations, stiffened eyes darted away too late. I knew the rhythm of a smear campaign. Vaughn had already set it in motion. Cambria tried to pretend nothing was different. She drilled her cadets twice as hard, her voice sharper than usual, her posture a perfect replica of control. But I saw the twitch in her jaw, the way she avoided looking at me across the yard. She was unraveling, caught between the sister she thought had failed and the commander she couldn't deny. By evening, my parents called. I didn't answer, but their voicemail was predictable. Dad's voice clipped and smug. "Whatever you've gotten yourself into, Morgan, leave Cambria out of it. Don't drag her down with you," as if I hadn't spent years keeping my storms from touching her. The tribunal notice came the next morning, a summons stamped and sealed requiring me to appear before the oversight board. No details, but I didn't need them. Vaughn's fingerprints were all over this. He'd laid the trap years ago, and now he was tightening it around my throat. The chamber was designed to intimidate wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to feel hostile, a row of officers seated like judges in an old courtroom drama. Cambria sat in the back shoulders, stiff eyes hollow. Sergeant Frey stood by the wall, arms crossed, unreadable. And then Curtis Vaughn walked in. He looked almost ordinary, gray suit-trimmed beard eyes that flickered with the smug control of a man who believed he'd already won. He carried a folder so thick the metal clasp strained against the paper. When he spoke, his voice was calm, rehearsed, clinical. "This tribunal will hear evidence regarding Commander Morgan Hale's failure to disclose civilian casualties during Operation Halbert Vaughn, announced sliding a redacted report onto the table." He pointed to a blacked-out paragraph. This section, scrubbed by Commander Hale herself, concealed fatalities caused by her indecision. She buried the record to protect her career. Gasps rustled through the room. I sat perfectly still. The presiding colonel turned to me. "Commander Hale, how do you respond?" "I don't." My voice was steady. "Not yet." That unsettled them more than any denial would have. Vaughn smirked, confident he'd pinned me. He didn't realize silence was my strongest weapon. For the next hour, Vaughn paraded evidence documents, timelines, blurry fragments of comm logs, all curated to make me look like a woman who'd abandoned her duty. He framed my absence from records as proof of guilt. He painted my reassignment to strategy as punishment, not promotion. He used every hole in Echo's secrecy as a noose. Through it all, I didn't flinch. I let him build the case higher and higher, brick by brick, because I knew something he didn't. Walls built on lies collapse under their own weight. When the colonel finally asked if I had anything to say, I slid a single laminated sheet across the table. Vaughn's name, his timestamp, his authorization on the directive to clear the perimeter without recon. "You gave the order," I said softly. "Then you cut the comm line. Not to save lives, but to make sure no one could question you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vaughn's smugness faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Forgery," he said. "An old printout. Anyone could have faked this." And that was when Frey stepped forward. His boots echoed across the chamber. He requested permission to play an audio file. Static filled the room. Then my own voice cracked through firm and unshakable "hold fire." Possible civilian presence. Wait for recon confirmation. No one moved. No one breathed. The colonel's face paled. Vaughn's jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grind. And in the back row, Cambria's hands trembled in her lap. But Vaughn wasn't finished. He leaned forward, eyes sharp. Even if she said those words, the fact remains her clearance has been compromised. Unauthorized access was triggered from inside this base. And who else could have planted the device but Morgan Hale? The board murmured. The trap was tightening again. He was clever turning Cambria's mistake into my alleged sabotage. I didn't look at my sister. I didn't need to. I already knew she was sitting there suffocating under the weight of what she'd done, terrified to speak. This was the storm Vaughn had planned. Evidence stacked, family whispers fed, loyalty tested. He wanted me dragged into the open, broken in front of the same family who had called me a failure. But he underestimated me. He always had. Because while he played checkers with accusations, I'd been mapping the board for years. And the next move wasn't mine. It was Cambria's. The chamber smelled of varnished wood and recycled air, sharp and stale at the same time. Every sound was amplified. The shuffle of papers, the scrape of a chair, the cough someone tried to stifle. Vaughn stood confidently at the podium, gray suit, pristine voice smooth as he twisted the tribunal into his theater. He pointed to the black screen behind him displaying rows of redacted logs. You see, Commander Hale's clearance has been compromised. Access was triggered from inside Fort Garnett, using her legacy code. Who else but her would have planted such a device? Who else benefits from burying these files? The officers leaned forward, hungry for resolution. They weren't malicious, just human, desperate for the clean answer that explained everything. And Vaughn was offering it. Morgan Hale, the failed cadet, the vanishing ghost, the liability. I didn't move. My stillness infuriated him. He thrived on panic, on people fumbling to defend themselves. But I wasn't playing defense. I was waiting. The colonel turned to me. "Commander Hale, what do you have to say for yourself?" I slid another document across the table. This one thinner, unassuming. Vaughn's authorization stamp date and time aligned perfectly with the operation he claimed I'd sabotaged. I didn't bury the record, I said. My voice was calm, measured. He did. Vaughn laughed too quickly. Forgery. A convenient scrap of paper. And that was when Sergeant Frey stepped forward. Without a word, he produced an old field recorder, battered and scratched, but still functional. He pressed play. Static hissed. Then my voice cut through firm and precise. Hold fire. Possible civilian presence. Wait for recon confirmation. The tribunal went silent. The sound filled the room like a ghost resurrected. Proof that I hadn't been reckless. Proof that I had done the one thing Vaughn swore I hadn't: protected lives. For a moment, no one breathed. Then all eyes turned back to Vaughn. His smirk had faltered, but he wasn't finished. He leaned into the microphone, voice sharp. "Even if that's true, Commander Hale's clearance is compromised. She's been operating under a ghost protocol erased from the system, and yet somehow her device triggered access inside this base. That is a security threat. That is grounds for termination." The colonel's gaze landed on me. This was Vaughn's last card, and it was the one that cut deepest. He was right about the breach. What he didn't know was who had caused it. I could have stayed silent, let the tribunal tear me apart to protect Cambria. But then I saw her back row, pale, jaw clenched, hands trembling as she clutched her knees. She looked like I once did a soldier with a mask cracking under the weight of silence. She rose. At first her voice shook. The breach wasn't hers, she said. Heads turned. Officers frowned. But then her spine straightened. Her voice sharpened. It was mine. The words ricocheted through the chamber like live fire. She stepped forward, holding up the brushed steel drive I'd slipped her months ago. I found this in my gym bag. I thought it was nothing, but when I connected it, it logged me into something called Echo. I triggered the alert. Gasps again. Cambria's face was flushed, but her eyes burned steady. She didn't compromise the system. I did. And that breach led to a node Vaughn left behind unauthorized code injections tied to a false contractor ID. He wasn't protecting records. He was rewriting them. The colonel's head snapped toward Vaughn. Is this true? Vaughn's composure cracked. He tried to deny it, but his voice was too quick, too defensive. Cadet Hale doesn't understand what she saw. Then explain this. Cambria cut in her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. She slammed the printed logs onto the table pages, marked with Vaughn's digital fingerprints timestamps from years earlier code that had been lying dormant until her mistake woke it up. The room tilted. Vaughn's face drained color. For the first time, I let myself lean forward, voice low, steady, cutting through the tension. You didn't just try to bury me, Vaughn. You tried to rewrite history. You planted traps so if anyone got close to the truth, they'd trigger your false narrative. But you got sloppy, and you underestimated the one thing I've always been good at: surviving quietly. The colonel turned to Vaughn. You stand accused of falsifying operational records, unauthorized code injection, and attempting to sabotage a commander's clearance. Do you have anything else to say? Vaughn's mouth opened, then closed. The arrogance drained from his face, leaving only fear. For once he had no script. The verdict came swiftly. Vaughn was stripped of his clearance, detained for investigation. My own record was cleared, rank reinstated. The board offered me recognition, a public statement, even the option to restore my name into permanent record. I shook my head. If being seen means others pay the price, I'll stay unseen. The colonel frowned, but he didn't argue. He only nodded. As the tribunal emptied, Cambria approached me. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. I almost destroyed you, she whispered. I shook my head. No, you saved me. You just didn't know it yet. She blinked, startled. You think survival is about never making mistakes, I told her. It's not. It's about standing back up even when everyone wants you to stay down. She pressed something into my palm, a small silver badge, simple, unadorned. I don't want to wear it, she said quietly. I want to deserve it. For the first time in years, I pulled her into an embrace. She didn't resist. The officers filed out. The chamber dimmed, and for the first time since I'd walked away from the uniform, I didn't feel erased. I felt whole. Not because I was seen, but because the truth stood taller than the lies. And Vaughn's echo, it had finally gone silent. The desert air at Fort Garnett was sharp that night, carrying the faint metallic bite of sand against chain-link fences. The tribunal chamber was empty now, stripped of its drama, its verdicts already signed. But I stayed behind for a moment, letting the silence settle. Cambria found me at the airstrip, her uniform jacket still buttoned too tightly, as if she believed rigidity could keep her from unraveling. Her eyes met mine, uncertain, searching. For years, she'd been the daughter lifted in toasts while I was the warning, the shadow. But tonight the lines between us blurred. She held out her hand. In it rested a small silver badge, polished but unadorned, not tied to rank or record. They gave this to me. She said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. A symbol of leadership. I looked at it then, back at her. You earned it. Her jaw tightened. I don't want to wear it, not until I know I deserve it. She pressed it into my palm, and for a second, her fingers lingered there, as if she was afraid to let go. I closed my hand around it. Symbols don't matter as much as choices, I said softly. Keep choosing right, and one day this will feel lighter. Her throat worked like she was swallowing words she couldn't say. Instead, she stepped closer. For the first time in years, she leaned into me, letting my arms fold around her. She didn't feel like a rival or a reminder of everything I'd lost. She felt like a sister. When the transport jet's engines roared to life, I pulled away. She looked smaller than usual, despite the sharp lines of her uniform. I could see the question forming on her lips, the one she'd never asked. Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why did you let me believe you'd failed? I spared her the weight of an answer. Some truths can't be spoken. They have to be lived. Instead, I slipped a folded envelope into her hand. Open it later, I said. She nodded, eyes glistening. Minutes later, I climbed the ramp and found my seat on the jet. The engines thundered, the ground fell away, and the desert lights shrank into dots. I pressed my hand against my coat pocket, feeling the edge of the silver badge cool against my palm. I didn't need medals. I didn't need applause. Echo had taught me the value of shadows, that you can hold the line without holding the spotlight. Somewhere below in the barracks locker, I'd once teased her into using Cambria would find the letter I left behind, one line etched in ink steadier than my breath. If you ever forget who you are, start here. As the jet pierced the night sky, I felt no bitterness, no need for redemption, just peace, the kind that comes when you've survived long enough to realize the quiet truth. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is the one that doesn't need to be seen. Have you ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated like you didn't belong, only to discover your strength in silence? Share your story in the comments. I read them all. And if you felt this story hit close to home, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the voices they try hardest to bury are the ones the world needs to hear most.